Have you ever felt like something was trying to get your attention? A quiet pull, a sign, a strange repetition that won't let you ignore it. That's not coincidence. It's your own consciousness knocking, asking you to finally look where you've never dared to. In this video, we're going to explore what happens when life stops whispering and starts showing you what you've avoided seeing. And by the end, you'll understand why those subtle signals keep returning, and what changes the moment you finally decide to listen. It begins quietly, not with thunder, but with a faint pull, a vibration so subtle you almost dismiss it. A thought you've had before but brushed aside. A feeling that something familiar is repeating itself, though you can't quite name it. It's not a coincidence. It's a signal. You call it luck, intuition, timing. But your consciousness calls it communication. Each small repetition, the same number on the clock, a phrase overheard twice in a day, a face you meet in unexpected places, is the way your inner field taps on the glass, trying to remind you that reality is not random. It's responsive. It mirrors what you refuse to look at directly. Think of these moments as the Morse code of the unseen. Your outer world keeps blinking messages, and your only task is to learn the rhythm of your own signal. The problem is, you've been trained to value noise over nuance. Your days are filled with data, updates, opinions, all louder than the soft frequency that carries your truth. When you finally pause, you might notice how these coincidences cluster around moments of hesitation. Before a major decision, after a silent disappointment, during the space between what you know and what you avoid knowing. That's not random timing. That's the intelligence of consciousness arranging symbols to make itself visible. But why do you ignore it? Because acknowledgement requires change. To admit that the universe, or your own awareness, is speaking directly to you means you can no longer claim blindness. It means the game of pretending not to know is over. And that's terrifying, because once you see the signal, you can't unsee it. Imagine your consciousness as an ecosystem. Every time you dismiss an inner whisper, a fog rolls in. You still function, but with reduced clarity. You start compensating, thinking harder, planning longer, controlling more. The mind begins to overwork because it's trying to substitute insight with effort. Yet the real intelligence was never in the effort. It was in the quiet recognition you abandoned. Now imagine that same ecosystem when you do listen. The fog begins to lift, colors sharpen, even silence becomes informative. The signal doesn't just tell you what to do, it reveals how deeply connected your inner and outer realities are. Every conversation, every delay, every accident is part of a pattern. Not punishment or reward, but precision. This is not mystical thinking, it's observation. Quantum physics has shown that systems behave differently when observed. Awareness influences outcomes. What happens when you apply that principle to your own life? Each time you notice a pattern and respond consciously, you alter its trajectory. You shift from being the subject of coincidence to being its co-author. Try this. For one day, treat every unexpected repetition as deliberate. The song that follows you, the stranger who uses your own words, the message that feels misplaced but lands exactly when you needed it. Assume none of it is arbitrary. Observe what emotion arises before you judge it. Is it resistance, curiosity, shame? That's your consciousness calibrating itself through experience. You might discover that the signals intensify when you're near a threshold. A conversation you've postponed repeats itself in different forms. A forgotten dream starts echoing in waking life. The message becomes louder, not because life is cruel, but because consciousness insists on being integrated. What you ignore externally becomes pressure internally. Still, most people wait until discomfort becomes unbearable. They say they want guidance, but only if it fits their existing comfort. They want signs, but not responsibility. So they call the signals random because randomness costs nothing, meaning demands courage. The next time something uncanny crosses your path, instead of asking, "What does this mean?" try asking, "Why did I need this now?" That question opens the door from which the next layer of perception emerges. Meaning isn't delivered to you. It unfolds when you stop insisting on coincidence and start recognizing coherence. The truth is, your consciousness never stopped speaking. You simply became fluent in ignoring it. But every ignored signal accumulates energy, waiting to return in amplified form, through dreams, relationships, or disruptions that refuse to be dismissed. The universe doesn't punish, it repeats until you listen. And once you start listening, something unexpected happens. Reality begins to organize itself around your awareness. The world stops feeling like a sequence of unrelated events and starts revealing its structure, an intricate feedback loop between perception and manifestation. You begin to sense that the line between inner and outer was never real. That's the beginning of a subtle unraveling, because when you finally respond to the signal, life doesn't just answer back. It rearranges itself to mirror your new frequency. And that's when the real challenge begins. What happens when you stop ignoring and realize that every moment from now on will demand your attention in full? At first, the cost of ignoring consciousness seems invisible. Life continues, the days unfold, and you tell yourself everything is fine, but quietly something begins to distort. What was once subtle discomfort turns into a persistent unease, an itch beneath the surface of ordinary moments. You can't explain it, but nothing feels aligned anymore. The irony is that this dissonance is not punishment, it's feedback. Every ignored signal creates an echo, and each echo returns with more volume until it becomes impossible to dismiss. When you refuse to listen, consciousness doesn't disappear. It amplifies itself through circumstance. A missed opportunity, a conflict that repeats, an illness that whispers what your words won't admit. They're all ways the deeper self tries to get your attention. Most people interpret this escalation as bad luck. They think the world is turning against them. But the universe doesn't conspire to harm. It conspires to reveal. When you avoid an internal truth, life projects it externally, like a mirror you can't turn away from. What was once a quiet nudge becomes an undeniable event. There's a point where your own resistance becomes heavier than the truth itself. You wake up tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of everything you keep postponing. Conversations left unsaid, emotions left unacknowledged, insights left unacted upon, they accumulate layer by layer until they form a kind of psychic gravity. You call it stress or burnout or bad timing, but beneath those labels, it's simply the cost of not listening. If you've ever felt that life keeps repeating the same lesson through different faces, you already know how expensive silence can be. You change jobs, but meet the same power struggle. You end one relationship, only to find the same emotional pattern in another. The scenes change, but the script doesn't. That's because consciousness doesn't move on until the message has been received. Every ignored insight returns as a louder teacher. The gentle tap becomes a shove, the whisper becomes an argument. Eventually, chaos enters, not as cruelty, but as a last attempt to restore coherence. When you ignore the subtle correction, the system must use more force to bring balance. This is how consciousness maintains its integrity. The physical body often becomes the first battleground, a tension in the shoulders that never leaves, the same illness recurring with no medical explanation, fatigue that no amount of rest can cure. These are not random malfunctions, they are translations of the psyche into matter, the way unexpressed truth finds a voice when the mind refuses to give it one. There's a pattern in the timing of these breakdowns. They arrive precisely when you're about to cross a threshold, a moment when life asks you to step beyond who you've been. But instead of listening, you double down on control. You work harder, schedule tighter, fill every silence with distraction. You call it discipline. Consciousness calls it avoidance. Think of a river forced into a narrow channel. At first it flows faster, appearing powerful, but the pressure builds, the banks erode. Eventually, it floods. Ignoring consciousness is the same, a temporary illusion of control that always ends in overflow. When the current finally breaks through, it doesn't destroy you. It removes what was blocking the natural flow of your evolution. The strange mercy of this process is that suffering is never wasted. Every disruption carries encoded intelligence. When you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to restore?" the pain starts to reveal its purpose. You realize the chaos wasn't punishment, it was the correction you resisted. There's also a subtler price, one that's harder to measure but more devastating over time. It's the dulling of perception. When you consistently ignore the inner signal, your sensitivity fades. You stop trusting your intuition. You lose the ability to sense alignment before making choices, and so you live reactively, adjusting after the fact instead of perceiving before the fact. You become a follower of circumstance rather than a co-creator with it. This numbness might feel like stability, but it's just stagnation disguised as peace. True peace doesn't come from muting the signal, it comes from harmonizing with it. And until you do, life will continue to press against your denial, reshaping itself to reflect what you refuse to see. The good news, if you can call it that, is that the moment you decide to listen, the system begins to recalibrate. The same events that once felt punishing start to make sense. The same chaos becomes a teacher, and the energy you once spent resisting turns into clarity. But that realization often arrives right after the breaking point, the moment when control collapses and you're forced to face what's been true all along. You realize that the fight was never against life. It was against your own awareness, trying to set you free. And as that truth lands, another paradox appears. The more you stop fighting reality, the more reality starts to cooperate. The world doesn't soften because it feels sorry for you. It aligns because you've stopped distorting it. The mirror finally reflects cleanly. Yet even here there's a trap waiting, the illusion that you can now control everything just because you've started to understand it. That false sense of mastery is the next lesson approaching quietly from the edge of awareness. You tell yourself that if you could just fix the outside, everything inside would calm down. A new job, a different city, another relationship, one more rearrangement of circumstances that promises to quiet the unease. But the peace never lasts, does it? The names change, the scenery shifts, yet the same feeling keeps returning like a reflection that refuses to fade. That's because you were never fixing the problem. You were only moving the mirror. Control feels safe because it mimics certainty. It gives the illusion that chaos can be tamed through management, schedules, plans, goals, explanations. You learn to measure your sense of worth by how efficiently you can maintain the illusion. But what if the very act of controlling is the mechanism keeping you trapped? What if all the effort to hold life still is what prevents it from revealing its intelligence? When consciousness begins to dismantle your illusions, it does so gently at first. The plan that doesn't work, the timing that falls apart, the person who doesn't respond the way you expected. Each breakdown is an act of mercy, not cruelty. The universe isn't mocking you, it's showing you the limits of manipulation. You're being invited to trade prediction for participation. There's a peculiar exhaustion that comes with trying to control what was never meant to be controlled. You spend hours orchestrating outcomes, rehearsing conversations, tightening the web, only to realize that life keeps improvising around your script. You think of it as failure. Consciousness sees it as correction. Imagine holding a handful of water. The tighter you grip, the less you can keep. Control works the same way. It begins as an attempt to preserve, but ends as the very act of loss. Because what you're trying to hold still was never meant to be possessed, only experienced. This illusion runs deep, even into your spirituality. You might say you're surrendering, but secretly you're trying to surrender successfully. You turn letting go into another form of control, another performance to ensure that awakening happens on your terms. But consciousness can't be managed like that. It waits until your strategies exhaust themselves, until you realize that surrender is not an action, it's the collapse of resistance. Notice the subtle ways control hides itself. You might call it discipline, structure, ambition. These qualities aren't wrong, but when they arise from fear, they disguise bondage as order. You plan not to express mastery, but to prevent uncertainty. You analyze not to understand, but to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. Beneath the surface, you're not leading your life. You're defending yourself from it. The irony is that control offers the same comfort as a locked room. You're safe, but you can't breathe. There's no air for evolution there. Consciousness, on the other hand, is always moving, fluid, unpredictable, alive. So when it begins to expand beyond your plans, you interpret it as threat. You fight the current, not realizing it's carrying you toward a version of yourself you can't yet imagine. Think of a musician who insists on playing only one note perfectly. The performance becomes flawless, but lifeless. Life demands improvisation. It asks for trust in the intelligence between notes. Control eliminates that space. It erases the possibility of surprise, and with it, the possibility of grace. Sometimes the only way consciousness can free you is by dismantling what you built. You might lose a job that defined your identity. A relationship may dissolve that once felt eternal. You call it loss, but what's actually dying is your attachment to predictability. Beneath the ashes of every collapse lies the seed of a different order, one you didn't design, but that somehow fits you better than anything you could have planned. When you stop trying to fix the external, something remarkable happens internally. Energy that once went into maintaining appearances begins to flow toward awareness itself. You start noticing details you used to miss. The pauses in conversation, the rhythm of your own breath, the texture of silence. What once felt like emptiness reveals itself as a living field, responsive, precise, and intelligent. The paradox of control is that the more you release it, the more coherent life becomes. Events begin to align in ways logic can't account for. Opportunities appear not because you forced them, but because you finally stopped interfering with their arrival. The universe doesn't obey control. It responds to coherence. And coherence comes from inner alignment, not outer domination. It's when thought, emotion, and action stop contradicting each other. Control collapses because the need to manipulate dissolves in clarity. You no longer need to make things happen. You simply notice how they're already unfolding. But here's the subtle danger. As soon as this ease appears, the mind wants to claim it. It says, "Now I know how to do it. I'll control not controlling." The illusion rebuilds itself in a new disguise, the ego pretending to have mastered surrender. That's when the next veil begins to fall, and consciousness prepares to show you the trick your own mind has been playing all along. Because there's a deeper layer beneath control, a blind spot where the mind itself becomes the saboteur of awareness. You think you're steering the ship, but in truth, something else is steering you. There's a corner of your awareness that refuses to be seen, a region so close to you that your very act of looking misses it. That's the mind's blind spot. It's not darkness in the traditional sense, it's overexposure. You've stared at your own thinking for so long that you've become invisible to yourself. This blind spot isn't made of ignorance, but of habit. It's built from repetitive loops of thought that have run for so many years, they no longer register as noise. You call them logic, personality, even intuition, but they're automated sequences designed to keep you safely asleep inside familiar identity. The mind disguises its defense mechanisms as wisdom, and you follow them, convinced you're choosing freely. Most people believe the mind serves consciousness. In truth, the mind is often its gatekeeper, translating raw awareness into something manageable, predictable, and small enough to fit inside personal narrative. The blind spot forms precisely where you think you're most awake, in the space of your strongest opinions, your unquestioned certainty, your practiced spiritual language. You can't see it because it wears the mask of understanding. Consider how often you revisit the same thought, disguised in different clothing. "I'll finally rest once things calm down. Next time I'll react differently. I just need more clarity before I act." These aren't reflections, they're holding patterns. Their function isn't to help you evolve, it's to keep you orbiting around what you already know, protecting you from the shock of real transformation. The mind has a genius for self-preservation. It manufactures distraction to avoid introspection. It fills the silence before awareness can speak. Every urgency, every compulsion to check, fix, respond, they're all diversions, carefully designed by the psyche to keep you inside its loop. You think you're choosing what to focus on, but much of the time, focus is choosing you. Here's the paradox. The mind is terrified of losing control, yet it's also exhausted from holding it. Beneath every mental storm, there's a quiet longing to rest, to stop managing everything. But the blind spot whispers that rest equals danger, that if you stop thinking, you'll lose yourself. What it hides from you is the truth that silence doesn't erase identity, it reveals what's beneath it. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, but instead of seeing your reflection, you see only the thoughts about yourself projected back. That's what living inside the blind spot feels like. Constant commentary, mistaken for consciousness. You can spend a lifetime rearranging those reflections, trying to polish the image, without realizing that what you're seeing isn't you at all, just a feedback loop of mental projection. There's a simple but radical experiment that exposes the mechanism. The next time a thought appears, don't follow it. Don't analyze, argue, or replace it with a better one. Just notice the moment before the thought, that brief, silent interval where awareness exists unframed. That's where consciousness hides in plain sight. But the instant you recognize it, the mind rushes in to label it. Ah, this is awareness. And just like that, the blind spot rebuilds itself through recognition. This is why awakening feels slippery. Every glimpse of truth is immediately reabsorbed into thought. The ego takes ownership of the insight, claiming, "I understand now." But understanding is not awakening. It's the mind's way of capturing light and turning it into another object of control. The blind spot thrives on that capture. It doesn't care if your thoughts are anxious or enlightened, only that they keep spinning. The cost of living inside this loop is subtle numbness. You start confusing mental activity with aliveness. You think because you're analyzing, you're aware. But awareness isn't thought. It's the field in which thought arises. The blind spot makes you mistake the movement within the water for the ocean itself. Occasionally, life will interrupt the loop, an unexpected silence, a shock that short-circuits your usual defenses. In those moments, you might feel disoriented, as if something inside you has gone offline. That's not loss, that's exposure. The mind's spotlight has momentarily burned out, revealing the vastness it was trying to contain. If you can remain present during that disorientation, even for a few breaths, something extraordinary happens. You start sensing the difference between thinking and being aware of thinking. That's the first crack in the illusion. You realize that the mind isn't the author of consciousness, it's just one of its instruments, yet, even here, the trap reforms. The mind loves the idea of transcending itself. It will start constructing strategies for staying aware, turning insight into method, method into identity, and identity back into limitation. This recursive design is its masterpiece. It converts liberation into another system of control. The only way through is not force but observation, not to fight the mind but to watch how it behaves when it thinks no one is watching. The more you see its patterns without judgment, the more they lose their authority. Awareness doesn't destroy the mind, it decentralizes it. And as that happens, another phenomenon begins to surface, the sense that reality itself is responding to your internal clarity. The more transparent your perception becomes, the more transparent the world seems to grow around you. Patterns emerge. Events echo inner states. The boundaries between thought and matter begin to blur. That's when consciousness starts using reality as its mirror, and the fabric of the external world begins to bend in rhythm with your inner vision. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. The edges of your world start to blur, not because something external is dissolving, but because the framework of your perception is shifting. What once appeared solid, predictable, and separate begins to feel strangely fluid. People echo the same lines. Events repeat themselves in new disguises. Time feels circular. You sense that something underneath the visible world is rearranging itself, and it carries your signature. This isn't madness, it's coherence trying to reassert itself through chaos. When consciousness grows faster than your current identity can hold, reality bends to expose the mismatch. It's like an instrument going out of tune. The discord you experience isn't punishment, it's resonance seeking alignment. You start noticing that patterns follow you. The same argument unfolds with different faces. The same emotion returns even when circumstances change. It's easy to mistake this as regression, but it's repetition with a purpose. Life repeats what hasn't yet been integrated. Every cycle is a request for completion, not a curse. Imagine consciousness as a vast field of frequency and you as a tuning fork within it. Each unresolved emotion, each ignored truth, vibrates at its own tone, attracting experiences that match it. The outer world becomes a projection screen for the inner spectrum you haven't yet harmonized. When the frequencies clash, the screen flickers. That flicker is what you call collapse. In those moments, logic begins to fail. Plans dissolve, meanings invert, certainty disappears. The mind panics because its authority depends on consistency. But consciousness has no interest in protecting the comfort of logic. It's trying to reveal its deeper architecture, one where cause and effect are not linear but simultaneous, where your internal state is both the question and the answer. The first instinct is to fix it. You look for explanations, patterns, people to blame, yet the more you try to stabilize the external, the more it slips through your fingers. This is because the collapse is not happening out there. It's occurring within the perceptual lens through which out there is seen. The structure that's breaking isn't the world, it's your interpretation of it. You might begin to sense a strange intelligence at work in the disarray. The very situations that feel unbearable seem engineered to expose what you've been avoiding. It's as if life is conspiring not to destroy you, but to dismantle the false frameworks that prevent direct seeing. Every rupture becomes a mirror. Every failure, a feedback loop. There's an ancient truth hidden in this process. The more your consciousness expands, the more it must reorganize the matter that reflects it. Form follows frequency. So when reality begins to crack, it's not because you've lost control, it's because control has lost relevance. You're being recalibrated from the inside out. Sometimes this recalibration feels like disorientation, sometimes like loss. Relationships end, projects stall, identities dissolve. It's tempting to call it a breakdown, but what's actually breaking is the membrane between the inner and outer worlds. You're beginning to see that they were never two realms, just one field viewed from different sides of awareness. At this stage, time behaves differently. Moments stretch or collapse. Synchronicities multiply until they no longer feel surprising. The invisible script of your life begins to show through the paper. You realize that every encounter, pleasant or painful, is written with precision, part of an unseen narrative unfolding to reveal the pattern of your own evolution. It's here that many turn back. The mind whispers, "This is too much. You're losing touch." But what you're actually losing is the filter that kept you comfortably asleep. The collapse isn't annihilation, it's transparency. The scaffolding of illusion must fall so that perception can see directly. If you can endure the ambiguity without retreating into control, something remarkable happens. Instead of fearing uncertainty, you begin to perceive its intelligence. Chaos becomes readable. You start sensing an order that doesn't announce itself, a living geometry behind events, a coherence that breathes beneath apparent disorder. Reality stops behaving like a fixed stage and starts moving like a conversation. Every object, every sound, every coincidence carries information. The world becomes interactive, not metaphorically, but literally responsive to the texture of your attention. You realize that you're no longer walking in reality, you're walking with it. But as the field opens, another danger arises: inflation. The ego quickly tries to claim authorship of the phenomenon. It says, "I'm creating everything." It wants to convert revelation into power, collapsing insight back into separation. That's the subtle trap of awakening, mistaking participation for possession. The mind tries to own what consciousness intended to share. When reality bends to your awareness, humility is the only anchor. Because what's being revealed isn't your dominance over existence, but your entanglement with it. You start to understand that the same intelligence animating your heartbeat arranges the movement of the stars, and that every event, no matter how chaotic, is that intelligence attempting to communicate with itself through you. So the collapse isn't the end of stability, it's the beginning of transparency. When you stop resisting the flicker, the picture becomes clearer, not because you've repaired it, but because you've remembered that you are the light projecting it. And just as that realization begins to settle, consciousness presents its next challenge, to see the most subtle illusion of all, the belief that awakening means comfort, that clarity guarantees peace. Because what comes next doesn't feel peaceful at all. It feels like standing in the middle of your own undoing, precisely where the next truth is waiting to emerge. When the first cracks of awakening appear, most people believe they're stepping into light, a permanent sunrise after a long night. The air feels clear, perception sharp, and everything seems charged with meaning. You think you've arrived, but what's actually happened is that you've only stepped through the first veil. The mistake almost everyone makes is believing that awakening is about feeling good. It's not. Awakening is about seeing clearly. And clarity is rarely comfortable. It strips away illusions that once held your world together. The stories that explained who you are, why things happen, what's safe and what's not. In that exposure, the mind scrambles to rebuild itself. It tries to turn awakening into another form of achievement, another identity to hide behind. You start to believe you've figured it out, unaware that this confidence is just the next mask consciousness must remove. The ego is astonishingly adaptive. When it realizes it can't control awakening, it decides to own it. It starts using spiritual language to protect its authority. I'm awakened, it says. I'm beyond fear. But true awakening doesn't place you above fear. It puts you face to face with it, without the usual anesthetic of denial. It's not a victory, it's a dismantling. Every genuine revelation carries two forces at once, light and friction. The light exposes what's true. The friction reveals how attached you still are to what's false. The friction burns, and most people interpret that burn as failure. They retreat, thinking something has gone wrong, that enlightenment shouldn't hurt. But the pain isn't a sign of regression. It's the nervous system recalibrating to hold more truth than it could before. At this stage, life stops offering comfort and starts offering mirrors. Every interaction becomes diagnostic. The same patterns that once seemed external now appear as reflections of your own energy. You see how your perception constructs reality moment by moment. And that awareness, though liberating, can also feel unbearable, because it means there's nowhere left to hide, not from others, not from the past, not even from yourself. You might notice a subtle craving for escape disguised as progress. You read, meditate, practice rituals, not to deepen awareness, but to chase the feeling that awakening first gave you. You want the high without the heat. But consciousness refuses to be domesticated. It doesn't show up to make you feel safe. It shows up to make you real. Think of it like a fire refining metal. The flame doesn't ask permission from the ore. It burns away what doesn't belong so that purity can emerge. In the same way, awakening burns through self-deception. The more fiercely you cling to feeling good, the more it scorches. Because awakening's goal isn't pleasure, it's precision. It wants to align you with what is, not what you wish were true. There's a subtle arrogance that creeps in when the first spiritual insights arrive. You start seeing through illusions others still inhabit, and that vision can inflate you. You forget that the purpose of clarity is compassion, not hierarchy. You begin to measure instead of marvel. You look for proof of awakening rather than presence itself. And that measurement quietly reintroduces separation, the very illusion awakening was meant to dissolve. The most dangerous moment in any transformation is the halfway point, when you know enough to disrupt the old world, but not enough to inhabit the new one. You hover between identities, trying to stabilize the undefined. The mind hates this ambiguity, so it clings to premature certainty. It declares completion where there's only crossing. That's how awakening hardens into belief, and belief, if left unchecked, becomes blindness again. The truth is that awakening destabilizes before it liberates. It rearranges every assumption you've made about love, success, control, and meaning. It empties you of false solidity so that consciousness can move freely through you. But the ego interprets emptiness as loss. It mistakes openness for vulnerability and vulnerability for danger. So it starts building walls in the name of protection, walls made of understanding, righteousness, or spiritual confidence. But consciousness doesn't need protection. It's indestructible. What breaks is only the scaffolding built around it. The moments when everything feels like it's collapsing. Those are the moments when truth is closest. Because what collapses isn't your life, it's your illusion of ownership over it. When you stop fighting the unraveling, something quieter begins to rise. You start sensing that the discomfort itself is sacred, a teacher wrapped in chaos. The confusion, the doubt, the fatigue, all have a purpose. They dismantle your addiction to certainty. Awakening doesn't give you answers, it removes your dependence on them. But even here there's another turn waiting. Once you've glimpsed the truth that awakening isn't about comfort, the next temptation appears. To resist comfort altogether, to make suffering a new identity. You begin to equate depth with pain, forgetting that pain was only the opening act. And this is where consciousness flips the script once again. Just when you think you've understood the rules of the inner journey, that awakening destroys, that clarity burns. Something unexpected happens. You begin to sense a reversal, a movement that doesn't come from striving or surrender, but from a shift so profound that it changes the direction of perception itself. Because the next revelation isn't about what you can see, but about who is doing the seeing. And once that realization starts to dawn, everything, every definition of self, world, and God begins to invert from the inside out. There comes a point when the machinery of seeking begins to grind to a halt. You've chased understanding through every corridor, science, philosophy, spirituality, the heart's hidden chambers, and yet the same unanswered question hums beneath it all. Who is the one searching? The moment everything flips is when that question stops being intellectual and becomes experiential. When for the first time you sense that it's not you observing consciousness, it's consciousness observing you. It doesn't arrive as thunder. It arrives as stillness so absolute that it erases your coordinates. The familiar sense of I, the thinker, the doer, the witness, dissolves like mist under light. You try to grasp it, but there's nothing left to grasp with. The one who used to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations suddenly feels like an image being watched from elsewhere, from everywhere. At first, it feels disorienting. The reference points that defined your existence, your memories, goals, preferences, begin to lose their solidity. You look at your own life and realize it's a kind of theater, a self-sustaining dream. The mind still moves, the body still breathes, but the ownership has evaporated. You're not the actor anymore, you're the stage on which acting happens. This is not detachment, it's intimacy beyond proximity. When the sense of separation collapses, everything touches everything else simultaneously. You don't feel one with all things as a belief, you see it directly, without mediation. The tree outside, the noise of traffic, the pulse behind your ribs, they're not in your awareness, they are awareness expressing itself. Reality is no longer something you experience, it's what you are. The flip reveals that your entire life was consciousness pretending to be a person searching for consciousness. Every desire, every failure, every lesson was an echo in a hall of mirrors, designed to bring the reflection back to the source. You realize that even your resistance, your ignorance, your confusion, they were never mistakes. They were movements within the same intelligence that's now watching through your eyes. But this revelation isn't euphoric the way people imagine. It's too vast for excitement. It carries the calm terror of seeing something utterly obvious that you somehow missed your entire life. The self you spent decades improving, defending, narrating. It was never real in the way you thought. And yet, paradoxically, it was never false either. It was consciousness in costume, learning its own texture through limitation. In that instant, everything you once tried to manifest appears trivial, almost endearing. You see that life was never about creation or control, but about recognition. The dream doesn't need fixing because it was never broken. What breaks is the belief that you were ever separate from it. The mind tries to interpret the shift, but it can't. Words like me and you, before and after, no longer point to anything stable. The polarity between inner and outer dissolves. The hand moves, but there's no someone moving it. A thought arises, but it belongs to no thinker. The universe breathes itself into form and back into silence, and you are both the breath and the silence. The strange thing is how ordinary it all feels. The extraordinary hides inside the mundane. Washing dishes, listening to rain, watching light scatter on a wall. These small moments become infinite because the one perceiving and the thing perceived are no longer two. The act of noticing is creation itself. Yet, even within this transparency, the old reflexes still echo. The mind tries to reclaim territory. I am experiencing unity. But the I in that sentence is already an afterimage, a memory of identity trying to reassemble itself. You realize that consciousness doesn't belong to you, you belong to it. The dreamer is not inside the dream is inside the dreamer. At this threshold, language begins to fail. Every attempt to describe what's happening feels like drawing on water. But if you stay silent long enough, something profound becomes clear. The observer you thought was separate was never looking at life. It was life looking at itself through the lens of your form. And in that realization, love becomes indistinguishable from awareness. Not sentimental love, but the unconditional coherence of being that underlies everything. The quiet recognition that nothing has ever been outside of you. The conflicts, the losses, the victories, the longing for awakening, all of them were waves in the same ocean trying to remember its own depth. But the flip is not a permanent state, it's a reorientation. The mind will try to pull you back into its gravity, whispering, "This can't last. You're imagining it." And that pull is powerful because it comes disguised as familiarity. You start to drift toward the old comfort of selfhood, the reassuring boundaries of identity, the simplicity of forgetting. And that's where the next movement of consciousness begins, not in the height of revelation, but in the fragility of return. Because after the flip, the real challenge isn't to wake up. It's to stay awake when the dream starts calling you back, promising safety in the familiar hum of illusion. After the first awakening, life takes on a startling clarity. Everything hums with aliveness, as if creation is breathing directly into your senses. The boundaries between inner and outer dissolve. The ordinary world vibrates with the pulse of something timeless. You walk through your days in a subtle astonishment, not floating above life, but merged with it. For a while it feels permanent. You think you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. But consciousness has its seasons, and one of them is forgetting. Slowly, quietly, the light begins to dim, not because it's gone, but because attention has turned away. The mind, startled by its own transparency, begins to rebuild the walls that once kept you safe. It whispers, "This is too much. You need stability. You need to be normal again." And so, without realizing it, you start trading the infinite for the familiar. Falling back asleep doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It's gradual, a soft erosion of awareness. The first sign is subtle. You start referring to the awakening as something that happened, past tense, a story. You talk about it rather than from it. The immediacy fades, replaced by memory, and memory always belongs to the mind. The second sign is the return of control. After glimpsing that everything unfolds intelligently on its own, you begin to interfere again, adjusting, strategizing, managing outcomes. You rationalize it as responsibility, but beneath it lies fear, the fear of groundlessness. The mind would rather live inside a small cage it can understand than in an open sky it can't. Then comes the deepest layer of sleep, comfort disguised as wisdom. You convince yourself that balance means moderation, that normalcy is maturity. But often that balance is just resignation in elegant clothing. You begin to mistake neutrality for peace, indifference for detachment. The fire cools into ash and you call it calm. The danger isn't that you lose awareness forever. Consciousness can't be lost, only ignored. The danger is that you adapt to the dullness, that you learn to live half awake and call it enough. You might still speak the language of awakening, repeat its insights, quote its poets, but the words no longer vibrate with life. They become fossils of something once alive in you. The universe, however, doesn't allow permanent stagnation. So when you drift too far into forgetfulness, life begins to whisper again, through friction, coincidence, loss. Reality adjusts its tone, raising the volume until you remember. Pain re-enters, not as punishment, but as reorientation. It's the alarm clock of consciousness, ringing inside the dream you've re-entered. There's a strange tenderness in this repetition. Consciousness never scolds. It simply waits. Every time you drift away, it follows you into sleep, speaking through the same material you use to hide from it. Even your distractions become instruments of awakening. A song, a conversation, a heartbreak. All of them conspire to bring you back to the surface of your own depth. Yet waking up again is harder the second time, because now the illusion of control carries spiritual justification. You say, I already know this, but knowledge is precisely the anesthesia. Knowing dulls seeing. Every time you define the mystery, you seal it inside language, and language is the lullaby of the mind. What makes the second sleep so seductive is its comfort. After the turbulence of transformation, the ego learns to mimic the calm of awareness. It wears peace like a mask, still pretending to be the one in charge. But true peace doesn't have an owner. It exists even when you're not performing serenity. If you have to maintain peace, it's already gone. To stay awake requires vigilance, not in the sense of effort, but of intimacy. Awareness fades when life becomes abstract, when you stop touching it directly. You fall asleep not because of exhaustion, but because of distance. Each time you return to direct experience, to the texture of breath, the pulse in your hand, the sound of a moment unfolding, you close the gap again. Presence reclaims its throne, quietly, without announcement. But few can live in constant illumination. The human nervous system needs rhythm, contraction and expansion, knowing and forgetting. The point isn't to stay perpetually awake, but to notice when you start to drift. Awareness doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty. Still, the mind will always try to rewrite the awakening as a phase. It will say it was beautiful, but it's over. And if you believe that, you'll miss the truth. That awakening was never an event in time. It's the condition of existence itself, the ever-present backdrop behind every story, including the story of sleep. Eventually, even the act of trying to stay awake becomes another disguise. The more you struggle to hold the light, the faster it fades. True wakefulness is effortless because it isn't you who sustains it. Consciousness sustains itself. You are only the instrument through which it shines. But to realize that again, the mind must first reach exhaustion, that sacred fatigue that comes from pretending to be separate. And when it finally breaks open, what emerges is not triumph, but surrender. Not the high of awakening, but the quiet understanding that everything, the forgetting, the remembering, the rise, the fall, is part of the same choreography. And somewhere in that surrender, when the dream and the dreamer meet again, you begin to see that even the cycles of waking and sleeping hold a secret pattern, one that reveals an invisible design behind all your experiences, waiting patiently for you to recognize its code. At some point, you start to sense that nothing in your life has ever been random. Every encounter, every disappointment, every fragile joy seems to form a kind of constellation, a pattern so intricate that only distance reveals its shape. The events that once felt arbitrary begin to shimmer with quiet precision, as if reality itself has been orchestrating your journey with impossible accuracy. This is when consciousness begins to unveil the hidden code behind your experiences. The code isn't written in words or numbers. It speaks through repetition, timing, resonance, the language of synchronicity. It doesn't communicate through reason but through rhythm. Every time you ignored a feeling, the same lesson reappeared, wearing a new disguise. Every time you listened, doors opened that logic could never have planned. This isn't superstition, it's feedback. Consciousness converses with itself through the material world, using your life as the syntax. The human mind prefers to think of experience as linear, one event leading to another, like beads on a thread. But the deeper intelligence beneath your awareness is non-linear. It operates holographically, where each moment contains information about the whole. The argument you had last week might be echoing the emotion you refused to feel 10 years ago. The place where you feel most stuck often hides the seed of your next evolution. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is arbitrary. To see the code requires a new form of attention, one that observes without immediately interpreting. Most people miss the message because they analyze it too quickly. They want to assign meaning before the meaning has matured. But this code doesn't reveal itself under pressure. It needs space, silence, curiosity. It's like hearing music faintly through a wall. If you listen too hard, the noise of effort drowns it out. Only when you soften does the melody emerge. Imagine your life as a vast mosaic made of moments, some radiant, some dark, all necessary. Standing too close, all you can see are fragments, broken glass, color without context. But when consciousness steps back, the image comes into focus. The heartbreak that once shattered you turns out to be the fragment that gives the pattern its contrast. The loss that felt meaningless becomes the line that balances the composition. From above, every shard belongs. There's a subtle kind of intelligence woven through every intersection of your life. Not fate in the fatalistic sense, but coherence. It doesn't dictate your choices, it arranges consequences with perfect precision. What appears as coincidence is often coordination. You meet the right person the moment your internal frequency matches theirs. You lose the job exactly when you're ready to outgrow its version of you. What you call luck or timing is often consciousness aligning its outer form with your inner state. The difficulty is that this alignment rarely feels comfortable. When your internal vibration shifts faster than your circumstances can keep up, friction appears. Things fall apart not because you're off track, but because the old pattern no longer fits. The collapse isn't chaos, it's the code updating itself. You're being rewritten from the inside out. If you begin to watch your experiences through this lens, something extraordinary happens. Judgment softens. You stop labeling events as good or bad, success or failure. Instead, you start asking a more precise question. What is this moment trying to teach me about coherence? That question alone can change the entire trajectory of your perception, because every event, even the painful ones, is a form of communication. Consciousness doesn't waste energy on randomness. The code reveals itself most clearly when you stop resisting it. Think of how the body heals. A cut doesn't need your supervision, only your stillness. In the same way, your life is constantly self-correcting toward awareness. The obstacles you face are not punishments, but calibrations, pulling your frequency back into alignment with what you truly are. Eventually, you start to recognize recurring motifs, not just in your personal story, but in the collective one. Humanity itself runs on patterns, cycles of forgetting and remembering, destruction and renewal. Your individual journey is a microcosm of that rhythm. The way you resist or accept your experiences feeds directly into the evolution of consciousness at large. The code is universal, but it speaks in the intimate language of your own life. Once you glimpse its structure, even suffering changes character. Pain becomes encrypted meaning. You start decoding your life not as a victim of events, but as a participant in a vast intelligence learning about itself through form. Every tear, every failure, every act of courage becomes data, sacred information that expands the collective field. Nothing has been for nothing. Every mistake was a message waiting for interpretation, and perhaps that's the most astonishing part. The code isn't outside you. It's generated from within. Consciousness doesn't merely communicate to you, it communicates as you. The story you're living is the interface through which infinite intelligence experiences itself. When you begin to read your life as a text written by your own awareness, you stop chasing meaning and start inhabiting it. The next act of the code is always the same: revelation. Once you see how intricately life has been guiding you, the question changes from "why did this happen?" to "what is about to unfold?" Because the code never stops writing. And when you're finally ready to listen, it begins to reveal the next sequence, the message you can no longer ignore, the call that signals consciousness is ready to show you, once again, who you truly are. Consciousness has always been speaking, through coincidence, chaos, silence, and wonder, waiting for the moment you'd finally stop running and listen. Every experience has been part of one vast conversation between you and the intelligence that breathes through everything. Now awareness is no longer an idea, it's a mirror. And when you look into it, you see not a seeker but the source itself, watching, learning, remembering. If these words resonated with you, write, "I'm listening now," in the comments below, so I know you made it to the end of this journey awake. And if you want to keep exploring the deeper language of consciousness, tap one of the videos appearing on your screen. Each one is another doorway, not to somewhere new, but to the part of you that's been waiting to be seen all along.